Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week,
by burning copies of the Quran.
the Quran burning that didn't happen, the media circus that did. What in Le Monde is happening with President Sarkozy in France? And why are those TV channels in Moscow beating up on the mayor? The media war between the New York Times and Rupert Murdoch. Who's got the weapons to win it? Who will be the collateral damage? And where will the story end? A little more than 40 years ago, the American conceptual artist Andy Warhol made a prediction. In the future, he said, everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes. And the Florida-based pastor, Reverend Terry Jones, has made Warhol's words sound positively prophetic. But he could not have done it without the media. Jones's plan aborted at the last minute to hold an international Burn a Quran Day on the anniversary of the 9/11 attacks began as a video announcement on YouTube, then went mainstream, had American military commanders, even President Obama, talking about it, and provoked protests in America, Afghanistan, and the Far East. Among the many unsettling aspects of Jones's story is this: what local media in Gainesville, Florida, initially treated as a non-event organized by a preacher they considered to be a non-entity, somehow grew into the biggest story in the global media. And once it snowballed, there was just no stopping it. Our starting point this week is a small church in Florida, a story that began in obscurity and would have stayed there if only the media had let it.
Small-time pastor who has stirred up a big-time controversy.
The saying goes, if it bleeds, it leads.
The drama over a threatened Quran burning in Florida.
If it's an exciting story, then the media will jump on it.
A constant stream of criticism.
This is a major publicity stunt.
Are you going to burn the Qurans?
And it's done very craftily and done very, very well.
So there was this feeding frenzy around this particular pastor.
Now this story is getting so heated, the national media have in fact flew into Central Florida.
Starting with the numbers, the number of people behind the movement compared to the coverage they attracted.
So did the media in the U.S. Cover this Quran burning story right? Of course not.
Pastor of a tiny congregation in Florida.
So the people who are going to burn the Quran was a church of barely 50 people. 50 people is nothing in this country. There's 300 million people in this country.
They are a very, very slim minority. And a very radical minority, but nevertheless, it is the radical minority, the ones with the loudest bark, that get the most attention. And unfortunately, the media are both falling into that trap and utilizing it.
Pastor, don't you even have a twinge of conscience about doing something like this?
So you've got a combination of both the media being a pawn, but also being somewhat parasitic.
There's kooks and crazies all over the country that do a whole bunch of things. I bet you can find a church with 50 people who believe that Muslims are all Martians. So should we have stopped everything we were doing and do 24/7 media coverage on, oh my God, Americans think Muslims are from Mars? No, because they're not all Americans. They're a tiny, tiny fraction of the country.
Pastor Terry Jones having...
It was not just the U.S. media that drove the story through its coverage. Media out of the Middle East were crucial in the early stages. It was their coverage of the story and the reaction it caused in Afghanistan that provoked a public reaction in the upper echelons of the American military.
I think once General Petraeus weighed in to say flat out that Pastor Jones's burning the Qurans would endanger U.S. troops, I think that took things to a new level. After General Petraeus made his comments, I think people in the media felt freer to really condemn Pastor Jones and also to criticize the media for making this more of a story than it perhaps should have been.
Still, the story was growing bigger.
Pastor Jones, let me ask you first.
There have been Koran burnings in the U.S. before, but for a variety of reasons, timing among them, this one moved into a different category of coverage. It came on the heels of the debate over that proposed Islamic community center in Manhattan that the media mistakenly and repeatedly called the Ground Zero Mosque. And it's election season in America. Congressional seats are up for grabs in November. So politicians waded into what was becoming a vicious circle of media coverage.
It's wrong to burn the Koran.
You've got this incredibly combustible situation. It's also an incredibly effective way to really drive a wedge between politicians and their constituencies. So you've got that dynamic as well. And then the decision to burn the Qurans happens to fall on September 11th, and it coincides almost ominously with Eid al-Fitr, probably one of the holiest times in Islam. It's a perfect storm, if you will, from a media perspective.
And then the politicians would have to weigh in on it. It went all the way up to the president. The defense secretary called this pastor, Terry Jones, to talk him out of it. This is madness. The media coverage is directly proportional to the amount of blasphemy that is considered throughout the world. So if a Quran burns in the woods, it doesn't really count. But if it's burned on national TV, then it's blasphemy, and it gets worldwide coverage.
The news is carrying reports that...
Realizing the coverage was amplifying the story, the American Secretary of State asked the media to stop doing that. That set off more of the kinds of debates that were already happening within newsrooms. Then the Associated Press news agency decided it would cover the event in Florida if it went ahead, but not show images of a Koran in flames.
You could see it sort of dawning on many in the media that they were really doing a lot to drive this story beyond all proportion.
We debated for a long time today whether or not to even cover this story.
I think they kind of stepped back from the brink a little bit there and started questioning themselves and say, where are we going here? One of the effects of the Terry Jones incident has to, make a lot of Americans take stock, many of those in the media as well, and I happen to think that is for the good.
However, the next time a story about Islam and America comes along, like the Koran burning that wasn't, or the mosque that wasn't, and wasn't even where they said it was, will the media, many of them commercially driven, fall into the same pattern?
It doesn't really drive ratings to have people on television to have a reasoned discussion about the various nuances of Islamic faith and U.S. policy.
This is putting our country in harm's way right now.
It drives ratings to have people on to argue and call each other terrorists and deny that they're terrorists and to make all kinds of wild claims about Islam. That's just the unfortunate reality of the media.
So I have a crazy idea. Since we know we have a lot of people in the country that believe a lot of different things, and in our country they get to believe that and act upon that, how about we don't cover all those crazy people? Because if we cover them, people make the mistaken impression that they represent this country, when they do not.
Our Global Village voice is now on the Koran burning story and the media's role in it.
The story of the proposed Islamic Cultural Center in Lower Manhattan was blown from being mostly a local issue into a national controversy. Several weeks later, the story of Reverend Terry Jones's planned Quran burning, yet another story that only has relevance to a small number of people, flared into an international story. If it were not for the media's overreaction, both stories would have remained on the local level, where they both belong.
The reason the high-level figures in the US government and military urged Jones back down is because they knew the power these images would have. White Christian American burning Qurans would be an effective recruiting tool for extremists all around the world. That suggests something about the power of images and how influential the media can be in spreading those images.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. France's leading newspaper Le Monde has accused President Nicolas Sarkozy's office of ordering an illegal probe into the newspaper's reporting of the president's campaign funding scandal. Earlier this year, Sarkozy reportedly tried to intervene in the sale of the paper to ensure that it went to a group of investors who would be kindly disposed to his government. The paper and its employees, who own a significant portion of the publication, fought the president on that and won. Then Le Monde picked up on a report that first broke on Mediapart, a news website formed by former Le Monde journalists, that the president had accepted illegal donations from L'Oréal heiress Liliane Bettencourt during his 2007 presidential campaign. In a front-page editorial, Le Monde is saying that Sarkozy tried to stifle reporting of the L'Oréal case, which the newspaper said was illegal under French whistleblowing laws. Now French police have confirmed that they are investigating a senior official in Sarkozy's government in relation to the Bettencourt story. It looks like the mayor of Moscow has fallen out of favor with some heavy hitters at the Kremlin after a number of scathing reports aired on state-controlled television. Mayor Yuri Luzhkov, who's been in office since 1992, said he will be suing the TV channels for defamation after their reports accused him of improperly helping his billionaire wife get rich. The anti-Luzhkov campaign did have a coordinated feel to it, with NTV, Channel 1, Rossiya 1, and Rossiya 24 all airing unprecedentedly critical reports on the mayor. Kremlin watchers say this makes it official. Lushkov is now out of favor with Prime Minister Vladimir Putin and President Dmitry Medvedev, who control most of the media in Russia. Lushkov's wife and her company, Inteco, are also preparing court documents and issued a statement accusing the channels of, quote, showing knowingly false materials without caring to simply check the information, unquote. Last week, we ran that story on journalists in Colombia targeted by the government for some critical reporting on social and political issues. And we explored whether anything will change now that the former president, Alvaro Uribe, has made way for his successor, Juan Manuel Santos. The early signs are not encouraging. An arrest warrant has been issued for William Parra, a well-known Colombian journalist now based in Venezuela, over allegations of terrorist activities and sedition. Parra is accused by Colombian prosecutors of having ties to the FARC, the leftist guerrilla force that has been fighting the government since the early 1960s. The prosecution claims it has intercepted email correspondence between Parra and the late Raúl Reyes, a former FARC leader, that allegedly implicates Parra. Parra, who has worked for Telesur, the left-leaning Venezuelan TV news network, has denied any guilt, and the network released a statement saying, quote, Telesur rejects this new effort to criminalize its journalistic work, unquote. The U.S. military insists it's downscaling its mission in Iraq, but the war on journalists there continues. 2 Iraqi TV presenters were killed in as many days earlier this month. Riyad al-Sareh, who worked with al-Iraqiya, was shot and killed outside his home in Baghdad. The next day, Safa al-Dine Abdul Hamid of al-Mosuliya TV was gunned down in northern Iraq. The Press Freedom Organization, Reporters Without Borders, says at least 230 media workers have been killed in Iraq since 2003, making this war the deadliest conflict for journalists since World War II. And remember last week we reported on the Associated Press's internal memo instructing staff not to refer to the U.S. combat mission in Iraq as being over, despite the Pentagon insisting that it is? Well, this past week, Reuters reported that some of the 50,000 U.S. troops remaining in the country resent the media reporting that combat operations have ended. Reuters quoted a staff sergeant criticizing one U.S. network in particular. He said, quote, NBC made it sound like everything is basically over to us. It was like a slap in the face because we're still here, and we are going in harm's way every time we leave out the gate. We're back after the break with a piece on the Grey Lady taking off her gloves in the fight with Rupert Murdoch. Welcome back. We're going to dig a little deeper now into a story that we touched on last week. The New York Times' investigation of a British tabloid paper that back in 2005 had at least one reporter illegally eavesdropping on the mobile phones of British celebrities, athletes, and politicians. The Times' investigation of the news of the world was unusual in that the paper was taking a long look into a 5-year-old scandal that took place in another country, a story that had no particular American news angle to it. What interests us at the Listening Post is not just that the tabloid's editor at the time, Andy Coulson, is now working at 10 Downing Street as a key media advisor to Prime Minister David Cameron. It's the media story that lies beneath the political story. Because if you read between the lines and check the reporter bylines, what you have is the New York Times using a 5-year-old story to attack the journalistic ethics of the company that owns the tabloid, News Corporation, and the man at the controls of News Corp, Rupert Murdoch. The Listening Post's Jason Mojica now on the latest salvo in the escalating war between the New York Times and the world's most powerful media baron.
It is a story that touches on the royal family, impugns the professionalism of the police at Scotland Yard, and vilifies the culture of one of the UK's biggest newspapers. On its surface, this is a story about tabloid journalism and a man named Andy Coulson. But if that was the end of the story, well, that would be the end of the story.
This is a reheat of an old story, but it's come back with seriously spiky knobs on it.
So let's take it from the top. Britain's celebrity set had long been perplexed by the tabloid's uncanny ability to unearth the details of their private lives. But a 2005 News of the World story about a private meeting between Prince William and his doctor gave away their technique. Clive Goodman, a News of the World reporter, and Glenn Mulcair, a private investigator hired by the paper, were subsequently arrested and jailed for phone hacking, accessing the private voicemail messages of their targets. Phone hacking may sound like a complicated technical procedure, but it's really quite low-tech. When you buy a new mobile phone, your voicemail package comes with a preset access code, something simple like 1234. The phone company urges you to change it for security reasons, but if you don't, anyone who knows your number and the name of your carrier can access your messages just as easily as you can.
I never condone the use of phone hacking, and nor do I have any recollection of incidences where phone hacking took place.
Although he was never directly implicated or charged, Andy Coulson was tainted by the scandal and resigned from the News of the World in 2007. But he has resurfaced as Prime Minister Cameron's chief spin doctor. That was no big deal in the British media until the New York Times entered the picture with an article in which Coulson was directly implicated by one of his former reporters, who said the man now working in 10 Downing Street knew all about the phone hacking and encouraged it. That gave the story new life.
Was Mr. Coulson aware of any use of unlawful phone hacking? Yes or no?
Mr. Coulson has made it quite clear that he had no knowledge.
Do you find it credible that the editor didn't know? We pressed him quite specifically on this, and he gave us his word that he didn't know.
He says he didn't know. I mean, what seems a bit far-fetched to me is that the private investigator was paid £100,000 a year, and a big part of his job was to hack into people's mobile phones. It seems odd that the editor, Andy Coulson, didn't know precisely what that £100,000 a year was being spent on.
Britain's parliament was in a tizzy. The New York Times was responsible, and this was no accident. The paper did not just stumble onto this story, it put 3 reporters on it for 5 weeks. 2 of them, Don Van Natta and Joe Becker, have Pulitzer Prizes on their resumes. The Times put their A-team on a story that an American paper would not normally be preoccupied with.
It's extraordinary that the New York Times took on this story on the face of it. So there must be a reason for doing it, and it's not to bring down the communications chief of the British Prime Minister. It's all to do with the News of the World being owned by Rupert Murdoch and the New York Times being locked into a circulation war with Murdoch's own Wall Street Journal.
Within the culture of the New York Times, NewsCorp is viewed as an unethical and disreputable news organization that carries within it a kind of corrosion of news ethics or news value. And my suspicion is that the Times, who views NewsCorp as a threat, will do more of this kind of stuff to expose what they view as the sort of corrupt heart of Rupert Murdoch's empire.
The fallout from this war has reached Scotland Yard. London's Metropolitan Police conducted a limited inquiry that led to just 2 prosecutions, but now admits that scores of actors, politicians, and public figures were targeted. According to the New York Times, several investigators said in interviews that Scotland Yard was reluctant to conduct a wider inquiry because of its close relationship with News of the World. That allegation, that British police are in cahoots with a tabloid, riled politicians even more.
They laugh at the law. They sneer at Parliament. Prime Ministers quail before them. And that is how they like it.
There's been a big furore in Parliament. And a big kind of witch hunt. People probably need to remember that at the time 2 journalists went to prison and the editor of a national newspaper resigned. So I'm not quite sure what else the News of the World can do other than, sack the whole staff and stop printing the newspaper.
That's a response that the New York Times would certainly get behind.
If they can tend to show that a newspaper operated even in a rogue way while being owned by Murdoch, then it suggests, in American terms, that he's a bad man, an evil man, and has no right to be owning a prestigious newspaper. And even if he does own it, readers and advertisers should beware of being involved with it.
In very callous terms, what they are seeking to do is cast doubt upon the credibility of NewsCorp itself, knowing full well that it is credibility alone that determines the success or failure of any news operation.
In launching this investigation, the New York Times has dusted off an old story and turned it into a fresh credibility problem for their adversary, one that's become awkward for Murdoch even on his own news outlets.
The News of the World, a News Corporation newspaper in Britain, used...
I'm not talking about that issue at all today, I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries, Mr. Chairman, that's fine with me.
The New York Times seems to have won this battle, but News Corp is a much bigger company, much richer and better armed for a protracted war.
News Corporation doesn't take these things lying down. So I would imagine that some of Murdoch's scribes are at this moment probing Sulzberger, the owner of the New York Times, probing perhaps the editor of the New York Times.
In other words, if you work at the New York Times and you haven't changed the access code on your voicemail, now might be a pretty good time to do that.
More Global Village Voices now on the Times, the news of the world, and the larger context.
American readers of the New York Times are very familiar with the role that Fox News, owned by NewsCorp, plays in our national political debate. But they may be surprised to learn, as I was, the extent that NewsCorp is now starting to control the media conversation in Britain as well as many other countries.
It's really important that while we must look at the individuals involved in the story, such as Andy Coulson's alleged involvement, we must also remember to take a look at the wider issues of journalism standards and ensure that they don't fall by the wayside.
Finally, the New York Times NewsCorp story is pretty complicated, but there's an easier way to tell it, with animation. This Taiwanese cartoon version of the battle between the Times and the Wall Street Journal focuses on Arthur Sulzberger, the Times' publisher, whose nickname is Pinch. Why would someone in Taiwan be interested in this? Because Murdoch's media holdings in the Far East are extensive, so he's pretty big news there. Now, the depiction of Mr. Murdoch in our video of the week is not the kindest. We could do without the fin. But there's no arguing that this is one media baron who hunts down his prey, and he's got teeth. We'll see you next time at the Listening Post.
纽约时报发行人小沙兹伯格继承了老爸的事业，可是没遗传到老爸的精明。报纸在他的领导之下表现越来越差，面对股价销量双双下滑的窘境，小沙兹伯格决定紧缩纽约的地方报道，来暂时解决财务危机。澳洲媒体大亨梅铎觉得有机可乘，他已经买下了世界上最有权威的财经报纸《华尔街日报》。现在又要《华尔街日报》发行地方版，单挑《纽约时报》。在这两大报的纽约之战中，梅铎的优势是新闻集团财力雄厚。小沙兹伯格虽然有墨西哥大亨撑腰，但资金硬是差了一大截。《纽约时报》真正的优势是160年来累积的权威，两方不甘示弱，开始互相挖角和广告割喉战。两大报战剑拔弩张，但媒体的大环境已经在转变。以后纽约客最爱的媒体，搞不好会是网站而不是报纸。